Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this seminar organized by Digital Pathways at Oxford, which is a research program here at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. This seminar is the fourth in a seminar series entitled New Frontiers of Digital Governance, where we are tackling the big questions in digital governance with some of the preeminent thinkers in the world presenting cutting-edge research to a global audience. The series will last for the rest of the calendar year, and we will have 8 seminars in total. And they'll be covering issues like inclusion and digital, mobile money, regulation of digital platforms, and others. And in this session, we are delighted to have Professor Sandra Wachter, who I will introduce in just a minute, presenting on AI and the biased society. Is Europe ready for an algorithmic world? Professor Sandra Wachter is an associate professor and a senior research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute, and her research focuses on the law and ethics of AI, big data, and robotics, and she works also on issues to do with internet regulation. You will have, or we will all have, the privilege of listening to some of her research this afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you might be. She is a prize-winning author with leading research, but also she has been very much engaged in the policy world, providing advice, policy advice to governments, to companies, and to civil society as well. She is a fellow on the World Economic Forum's Council on Value, Ethics, and Innovation. So why don't I hand over to Sandra to hear her speak, and she can speak to us on this topic. Over to you, Sandra.
Thank you so much, Dapo, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to be able to present some of my latest research. So on that note, I will try now to share my slides with you, and hopefully this will work. So if everything has worked fine, you should be able to see the slides now. I don't hear anything to the contrary, so I'm just assuming everything is fine. So yes, thank you so much for joining today. The topic of my talk is AI and the biased society. Is Europe ready for an algorithmic world? It's quite a timely topic, actually, because I think many of you will have seen that Europe is merging quite vigorously in the direction of regulation of AI. Only just recently, the Commission released their first draft proposal for an algorithmic regulation, the Artificial Intelligence Act, that is now being considered to be actual law, hopefully sometime in the future. It's a very, very long proposal, so I don't expect anybody to know it in too much detail, but I just wanted to focus on one particular provision in that act that is actually quite important for many of us working in this area. So there's an interesting Article 10 that talks about data governance, and it has to do with questions of fairness and bias testing, interesting enough, which is fantastic to see because it shows that the European Commission has understood that this is a very, very important topic to tackle. We cannot think about algorithms without thinking about bias. So actually having provisions in place that mandate that bias testing is being done, that proper training is being done, that validation methods are being implemented is extremely important. So I'm very excited to see how this will develop in the years to come, where this proposal is being fleshed out. But it's also very important that we already ask ourselves the question, how would we even implement those regulations in practice? How can we actually test for bias, and what does it actually mean? So what's interesting is that I only recently published a paper in January with 2 of my colleagues, Brent Middlestead, who is also here at Oxford, who is an ethicist by background, Chris Russell, who works in machine learning, computer vision, and me, myself, I'm a lawyer by background. The 3 of us published a paper, which is called Bias Preservation in Machine Learning, the Legality of Fairness Metrics and the EU Non-Discrimination Law. So it's actually quite timely, because what we did is try to figure out that the current bias tests that are developed to detect and prevent bias in machine learning are actually legally compliant with what the European non-discrimination law wants to do. So when we think about bias testing, this will be an important question. So the paper is publicly available and for free. So if anybody wants to have a deep dive into it, I highly encourage them to do so. I don't have a limited amount of time here, so I can only talk a little bit about the highlights, but I still hope that will be interesting teaser for you to actually look at the full piece. So let's start with the overview of the three things that I would like to tackle in this talk. I really want to talk about the idea of fairness and justice and discrimination in the law and what it actually means from a legal perspective. And then I want to take some time to talk about how computer scientists perceive and think about fairness. And the third section is going to tackle the unfortunate question that shows that those two notions of fairness in law and computer science are completely clashing. So let's start off. As I said, this paper is quite long. So what I want to do is start us off with the findings of the paper first, and then use the rest of the time to show you how I actually arrived at that conclusion. I think when we are thinking about AI and bias and fairness and justice, we are standing right now at a very, very important crossroad. We have basically three options ahead of us. We can either do nothing and just deploy algorithms as they are to make very important decisions and witness how they exacerbate existing inequalities in our society. Or there's a second path, which is the path that most of us are currently taking, which is trying to fix the technology, trying to make sure that things are not getting worse than they actually already are. And then there's the third option, my personal favorite, which is we could also use technology to actually improve society, to make society a better place, but it actually is a conscious choice and requires some action. So I think those three options are ahead of us, and we ought to make a decision because it is very important. The outcome is very different. So when I talk about fairness and justice and equity, I actually need to take a step back and talk a little bit about what I mean by bias. I think it's very helpful to distinguish between two types of biases. So this distinction has been developed by Nissenbaum, or is inspired by the definition of Nissenbaum that thinks about technical bias and societal bias. So technical bias means that the problem that you're facing actually stems from a technology itself. So one example is, for example, facial recognition software. So we know now that facial recognition software is less accurate on faces of women and faces of people of color. Why is that the reason? Because the algorithm has been trained on predominantly white faces. So it will be more accurate for white people, less accurate for women and people of color. So what you see is that there's a problem in the data set itself that then manifests itself in the real world when it's being applied to people who are then being wrongfully arrested, for example, technical bias. The other possible avenue is societal bias. So this is when this trouble actually stems from the human itself. So this is, for example, when you think about hiring, where somebody has a very ableist view and is not giving people a job who have a disability. This decision pattern of that hiring officer is then being fed into the algorithm. The algorithm learns this biased behavior and then makes the same ableist decisions in the future. So the distinction between technical and societal bias is not perfect, it's not perfectly clean, because one informs the other, obviously. There's a reason why the product team has designed face recognition in a way that it's only using white faces. It is just evidence of power structures there. However, I think it's still very helpful to distinguish between those two types of biases because it shows you what people are trying to fix. One bunch of people is trying to fix the technology. The other is actually trying to fix society. So the question is, what is the law trying to do? What is the law trying to fix? What does fairness actually mean in the law? Well, I think it will come as no surprise that law is about fixing society, but that doesn't give us enough answers. What does fairness actually mean in legal terms? And again, everybody will have heard of the fact that the law thinks that everybody's equal before the law. This goes back to Aristoteles, who said like cases ought to be treated alike, unlike cases ought to be treated differently. But again, the question is, what does fair and equal treatment actually mean in practice? And that important question is a fundamental conundrum in European non-discrimination law. A good example to exemplify that is actually a very personal story of myself. I must have been around 6 or 7 years old when we read a piece in school. The piece was called The Wise Judge. The Wise Judge goes back to a story where a brother and sister are fighting over a piece of cake. And they cannot decide how to divide up that piece of cake. So they go to the judge and ask the judge for advice. And the judge says, okay, you, the brother, get to cut the cake first, but you, the sister, get to choose first. And I still remember that story very vividly. And I thought, oh, that's elegant. What an elegant solution to make sure that everybody gets an equal piece of cake. And I think most of us will agree that that's a very, very elegant way of solving that problem. However, what if I told you that the sister hasn't eaten in 3 weeks? Would you still think this is a fair way of dividing up the cake or not? And this idea is exactly the tension that we find in European non-discrimination law. We have two ideas of fairness. We have one that is called formal equality and one that is called substantive or de facto equality. So formal equality means I'm treating everybody the same. I'm closing my eyes to the differences. I'm not taking into consideration race, gender, ethnicity, and everybody gets the same piece of cake. Substantive equality is different in a way that it is actually interested in the social differences between groups. It actually cares about whether some people are more hungry than others, and therefore takes it into consideration when cutting up the cake. Those two concepts are actually also reflected in the hard law itself. So in European non-discrimination law, we have prohibitions against direct discrimination and prohibitions against indirect discrimination. So prohibitions against direct discrimination means that formal equality is achieved. That means I am not allowed to treat you less favorably based on a protected attribute that you possess. So I cannot say, I'm not giving you the loan because you're a woman. I'm not giving you the job because you're gay. This would be direct discrimination, and it would be illegal in most instances. The other way is indirect discrimination, which is more in line with substantive equality. Indirect discrimination means when you have a decision criterion that is on the face neutral, right? A neutral provision, criterion, or practice that you apply to everybody equally, but it just so happens that it poses a particular disadvantage on certain groups when compared with others in a similar situation. So if I'm having a hiring requirement, right, that says I'm only going to hire people that are taller than 2 meters, very tall people, then height is not a protected attribute, but it will have an indirect effect on the hiring chances of women. So this is indirect discrimination. Again, in most circumstances, this is problematic, needs to be legally justified. So what you will see is that indirect discrimination actually is a tool that has been developed to diagnose whether discriminatory forces are at work. So indirect discrimination wants you to recognize that others have to overcome hurdles more than others. It is really about thinking where social engineering needs to happen. If the outcome isn't the same for everybody, then the law assumes there is something wrong with the system. If there is disparity between certain groups, then from a legal perspective, this needs to be justified. If it's not justified, you're going to be liable under the law. And if you look at the case law in itself, and if you look at what legal scholars have said for centuries, it is very clear that the declared aim of non-discrimination law is substantive equality and not just formal equality. So that means that both the private and the public sector actually have an active duty to dismantle inequality. to make sure that solidarity is fostered, to make sure that diversity is promoted, that social inclusion. So taking an active role in leveling the playing field is something that is expected of both the private and the public sector. So just saying I'm ignoring the social realities of groups is not good enough under the law. So this is what the law wants to do, what the law wants to fix. Let's see what computer science wants to fix. So I guess it will come as no surprise that computer science, as the field suggests, thinks about mainly text solutions when they think about fairness. Many fairness tests have been developed in the recent years to tackle AI problems and AI bias problems. The way that they do this is usually by applying something that is called conditional independence. So conditional independence means this is when you're making a decision about somebody. For example, if somebody should get a loan, you want to make sure that this decision is not dependent on protected attributes such as sex, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and also not dependent on a target variable. For example, a salary. So this is the idea behind this. What you're basically doing is you're trying to figure out if a new applicant looks like a past applicant, you compare them. If they're similar to somebody who repaired the loan, you give them the loan. If they don't, reject them. So based on this idea of conditional independence, making sure that the outcome is not dependent on protected attributes, we have come up with a classification system of the bias tests that are currently being created and being deployed. There's one bunch that we have termed bias preserving metrics and the other that we have termed bias transforming metrics. So bias preserving metrics mean the bias tests that are focusing on error rates. So the way that it functions is that the test looks whether the false positive rates and the false negative rates that you made in the past and that you're making now are being done at the same rate. So the underlying assumption is that you don't want to make more mistakes that you have done in the past, right? Same false positive, same false negative rates. Therefore, you're trying to preserve it. You're trying not to make things worse, therefore bias preserving. On the other hand, the rest of the tests that are out there that we have termed bias transforming metrics have a different approach. What they do is they look at decision rates. So they look at the outcome of decisions. They are interested if somebody gets a loan, how the loan decisions are being distributed across certain groups. This is the basic distinction. So let's go back to bias preserving, so the ones that are matching error rates. At first glance, it looks fair because what you're doing is you look at past data, you look at people who have repaired the loan, people who have done well at university, people who didn't break the law, and you're matching them against the new people that are now being assessed. So the ones that want to have a job now, they want to go to university, they don't want to go to prison. And you say, if somebody that did well in the past looks like somebody that is now applying for something, I'm going to give them the job. I'm going to give them the loan. If they don't, I'm not going to give them the loan or the job. So you're assuming that you have some ground truth because you have information about the past. So what you're trying to do is you justify the future by using the past, and you're using the status quo as your neutral starting point to make decisions. But the problem is that the status quo is all but neutral. And that is a very crucial problem that we need to come to terms with. I only have time to talk about one example here. There are many more examples in the paper if you're interested in digging deeper into this. To show you how perversive bias actually is, I'm going to talk about grades for just a second. I think everybody will be aware that, when it comes to grading, there is often a subjective element to it. But what about math grades, right? You could make an argument that math has some ground truth. 2 and 2 is 4, so there is not much room for interpretation. So if I was to say I'm building an algorithm that decides if somebody should be admitted to the computer science department at Oxford based on their math grades, could be seen as fair. But there's interesting research from 2015 that shows that teachers in middle school and high school assess the mathematical skills of boys more favorably than girls. And this is reflected in their grades, even though the mathematical abilities are just the same, if not better, of those of boys. They are offered less mentorship, which is also reflected in their grades. This gender bias travels with them to the job market, where research shows if you send out 2 batches of identical CVs to open job advertisements, right? One batch has female sounding names, the other batch has male sounding names, and that's the only difference between them. Both male and female assessors will rank female qualities or female CVs as less qualified than the ones of the male counterparts. If they're then actually invited to a job interview, they're being offered a lower salary than their male counterparts and are being often then overseen for promotions. The reference letters that we collect also have a very strong gender bias in itself. So, for example, women are often being described as team players and hardworking. Men are being described as trailblazers and geniuses. And you could say, well, then let's just tackle that gender bias at some point. Let's train people to think differently about traditional gender roles. But the question is, where do you actually start? Because I don't know if you're aware of it, but actually very early on in our life, children already have a very clear idea of what gender roles look like in our society. So research shows that by the age of 6, children already understands the role of men and women. So if you show children pictures of boys doing cooking and sewing, they will misremember seeing a girl. So very early on, we actually have those implicit biases in ourselves. And here's the problem. AI does not know about this. AI doesn't know about the social story between the data points. And I would say that probably many of us don't actually know how pervasive bias actually is. And now think about how often we use criteria such as grades, reference letters, or salaries as objective decision criteria to assess people. Think about how often grades open the doors to jobs and fellowships or to universities, and how often reference letters open doors to loans and housing, or how often we use promotions or high salaries as a metrics for success. And they also often form the basis on whether you get a loan, whether you get a mortgage, if you get insurance, and what kind of advertisement is being shown to you. On the face, those criteria look fair, but they're all but unbiased because the status quo is not neutral. And this is exactly where computer science and the law are clashing with their 2 different attempts of thinking about bias and fairness. To summarize it and just to bring it together, what you will see is that, as I said, you have this one class of bias tests, bias preserving metrics, that are looking only at the error rates to measure if something is fair. This approach is much more akin to formal equality. Everybody gets the same piece of cake. I'm not trying to change the underlying social structure. I'm not changing things. And then we have the other batch of bias tests that are out there that we have termed bias transforming. So those that are looking at decision grades, actually looking at the outcome. This is more akin to substantive equality. So the idea of changing things, changing society. And as I said, the law is very clear of what it wants us to do. It is about eroding inequality. It's about actively dismantling disparity. It's about achieving parity and inclusion. So keeping things as they are, freezing the status quo, is simply not good enough from a legal perspective. And that leads me basically to the main argument that we have made in that paper, that if you are in Europe, and you're using a decision-making system in a sector that is known to bias, for example, hiring, and you're using a bias-preserving fairness metrics, we argue that this gives rise to prima facie discrimination. Prima facie discrimination means it looks on the face discriminatory. When something is on the face discriminatory, you ought to justify this situation. If you cannot justify it, you will be liable under the law. So that is the main argument here. So after all of this, the first question that will come to mind is, okay, we talk a lot about bias preserving, bias transforming. Of all of those fairness metrics out there, how many of them are actually bias preserving? How many of them are actually freezing the status quo? So we have done an analysis in that paper with in an appendix, a very nice overview of the bias tests that are out there. Out of 20 fairness tests that are currently out there, 13, so 2/3 of them, are bias preserving. That means they're conditioning on the unequal status quo, using it as a neutral starting point to make decisions. So what we are saying, if you're using one of those in a protected sector in Europe, you need to legally justify. If you can't, you will be liable. So in short, the choice of a fairness metrics is not a neutral act. The choice of a fairness metrics is an explicit decision on whether or not the status quo is acceptable or not. And that is the main takeaway. It is not a neutral choice. Okay, fine. Let's say you agree with me, you buy into my argument. You have 20 of them here. Which of those should I be using for my purposes? So let's talk about the right choice of fairness metrics. This actually leads me back to prior research that I have done with the same group that I have been working on my most recent paper. So the paper is called Why Fairness Cannot Be Automated, Bridging the Gap Between EU Non-Discrimination Law and AI, again, publicly available if somebody wants to have a look. So what we try to do there is come up or answer the question whether the Court of Justice in Europe has an idea of what idea of fairness actually looks like. And of course, there is no perfect idea, but based on the ideal way of assessing evidence in court, we come up with a concept, a legal concept. And then we've asked ourselves the question, is there a technical counterpart? Is there a technical test that mirrors what the law wants you to do? And we came up with a test that is called conditional demographic disparity, which is, in our opinion, the test that gets you closest to what the law actually wants you to do. Very quickly, just to tell you how it actually works. It's very good for detecting heterogeneous, minority-based intersectional discrimination, much better than other bias tests that are out there. But the basic idea is that you're testing for bias, and you then required to publish the summary statistics of your tests, including the condition variables that you have used. Why are you supposed to do this? Because first of all, it shows you whether the outcome is equal across groups. And if they're not, you can see whether this is justified or not based on the criteria that you have been using to make decisions. So for example, if we're thinking about loan decisions, right? You could say, well, should we be using salary as a conditioning attribute to make decisions, or is this unfair? Because you could say, A, we know so much about gender and race income inequality. Should we actually be using such a criteria that has so much historical bias in it? Or should we say, well, yes, we know about existing and historical bias when it comes to income, but giving people loans who cannot repair it might actually indebt them further, right? So maybe it is okay to use income. Or C, you could say, okay, maybe not income, but maybe there is a less discriminatory variable that we can use to assess creditworthiness. And that is the crucial dialogue that we actually need to have, right? I cannot tell you what the right decision is. And in my opinion, it should never do that. It can only surface inequalities in a data set and then allow for public dialogue to happen, because it's for us humans to decide what society actually should look like. And I would hope that with testing for bias and publishing a summary statistics and the criteria being used to assess people, that this will give rise to a dialogue that needs to happen between civil society, consumers, regulators, and industry. Yes, so let me conclude with a couple of notes here. As I said, I believe that we are at a crossroad where we have three options ahead of us. I think we can do nothing and just deploy algorithms as they are using the bias data and just look how existing inequality will grow. There's nothing that we need to do for that, just sit there and wait. Or we can do what has been done the majority of the time, is trying to fix the bias, is trying to fix the technology and try and tackle the technical aspect of inequality. Or, and that's the third option, and as I said, my personal favorite, we can use technology and AI as a diagnostical tool that tells us where inequalities lie and then use it as a starting point to tackle that problem together. And I really hope that that is the conclusion, and really hope that technology can be used to fix society. And from a legal perspective, this is also what you're supposed to be doing, right? European non-discrimination law is subscribed to the idea of substantive equality, actual de facto equality, leveling the playing field. So just keeping things as they are not good enough from a legal perspective. The status quo is not neutral, and we cannot just accept it as it is from a legal perspective. The second thing that I wanted to as the main takeaway is that choosing a fairness metrics is not a neutral act. Every time you choose a fairness metrics, you're making an explicit decision on whether or not the status quo is acceptable or not. And if you're using a bias-preserving fairness metrics in a European context, in a bias-no sector, and you're using one of those, you need to legally justify it. If you fail to do so, you will be liable under the law. At least that's the argument we're making. However, as I said, it doesn't necessarily mean that all bias tests are problematic. There are situations where you can definitely use bias-preserving metrics, for example, in research or in jurisdictions where formal equality is valued more than substantive equality. So, because this is very complicated and you have to combine law, non-discrimination law, tech, and philosophy, we also came up with a checklist that we hope will be helpful for practitioners or anybody interested in this question of what is the right fairness metrics to use for me, depending on the purpose, depending on the jurisdiction, depending on whatever application I'm pursuing. So we hope that this will actually be helpful as a practical tool to navigate through that maze that is non-discrimination law and tech and ethics on top of it. As I said, my personal favorite is the bias test that we have developed in the previous paper in Why Fairness Cannot Be Automated. Again, because, as I said, it's called conditional demographic disparity, because we felt that this is the bias test that is most aligned with what the Court of Justice in Europe wants us to do. I'm very excited to share the fact that the research that we have been doing over the last couple of years has actually been picked up by many, many policy bodies, which is extremely exciting to see. So, for example, the European Commission, European Parliament in 2 reports this year and last year, and the Economic Forum, World Economic Forum in 2019 and 20 have cited our work and in their recommendations, which is extremely exciting to see. And only just now in January, Amazon has actually picked up our work as well. So Amazon has launched their own accountability toolkit, which is called SageMaker Clarify, which is a bias toolkit that is available to all Amazon Web Services customers. And independently from us, they picked up our work. And one of the bias tests that they're offering is conditional demographic disparity, so the test that we have been developed. So that is extremely exciting to see that the work that you do as an academic is actually useful for people working on the ground. So I hope that this will be helpful, not just for people that are customers of Amazon, but everybody, because I said the papers that we have written are publicly available, so everybody can use them if they wanted to. Let me just close by saying how I see the way forward. I think we have to come to grips with the fact that technology alone cannot fix society, and probably shouldn't, and that more data alone is not always the answer. What we actually need is a commitment to social change, and I think technology can help us with that. Bias transformation, bias tests like CDD are a fantastic tool for social change, because they do the thing that we want, that we need to do, which is having a very honest discussion on what kind of society we want to live in, what kind of biases and disparities and fairnesses are acceptable and which ones are not. And this is a situation that should be decided by us humans and not technology. And therefore, we must not allow technology to freeze the status quo. We will never achieve social equality if we settle for the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you. That was great. And just to let everyone who is watching and listening know that Sandra is available to take questions. And if you want to ask a question, please just put your question in the Q&A, and then you may be invited to unmute yourself and ask your question. Perhaps I can kick off with a question for Sandra. And actually, it's a basic one, I think, just to help me and perhaps others understand the areas where these challenges that you talk about are most pressing. So I was just wondering, in what policy areas do you think that the issues that you've been talking about arise the most? In other words, in what areas do we see that we actually need to sort of adapt the technology to be able to achieve the substantive equality that you're arguing for?
Yes. Oh God, what a great question. Unfortunately, I think most areas of our life are prone to bias. I think that's the unfortunate truth, that there is no such thing as neutral or fair data, because it always has the biases of our society embedded in it. It's clear if you think about hiring and inequalities that happen there. Think about past loan decisions, think about criminal justice, think about immigration, think about advertisement, think about healthcare. So if I'm very honest, I think most aspects of our life are touched by this. And we have to be very, very honest about the fact that probably inequality is a fact to be disproven rather than a fact to be proven.
Okay, thank you. So there are some questions coming in, and Sophia has a question in the Q&A. I wonder whether Sophia is available and whether she'd like to ask her question live. If Sophia wants to ask the question live, then just feel free to unmute yourself. And if you want to put your video on, you can do that too. I see Sophia coming on.
Okay. Hi. Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. I would like to thank you again for the presentation. Sorry. I would like to ask about the automated collection of biometric data, because all this talk about reducing bias needs to have some data as input. So I would like to ask about your opinion about new regulation concerning automated collection of biometric data in the EU.
Right. Yes. So I think what's very clear is that facial recognition software or automatic recognition of biometric data is probably one of the most controversial applications of AI that I can think of. If it doesn't work because it is biased, because it is trained on biased data, it is hurting people. But also, if it's being deployed accurately, right? Even if you train the system on accurate data, it also hurts people. So it's really, really a problematic field, and there are amazing researchers out there that have been tackling this question. So I highly recommend, for example, the Coded Bias documentary on Netflix that shows like the main leader in the field that have uncovered this problematic area. I'm very happy about the fact that the European Commission is tackling this as well. I'm also aware that many companies are also very uncomfortable in pursuing further with this technology without having clear rules in place. So the regulation at the moment foresees a ban for certain types of facial recognition software, but there are still exemptions here when it comes to criminal justice and investigating certain crimes. But in public spaces, at least, there's a ban for it, which I think is the right way forward. I think in the future, it will be very important to see how the details are being fleshed out of this. But yes, it's very early on. But I'm very happy that the Commission is tackling that problem, because I think it's about time that we actually think about the values and the risks that come with it.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sophia. Sandra, I had another question for you, actually, in relation to the argument that you're making about, ensuring that what we're trying to do is to achieve substantive equality. Because I was thinking that, which is a very powerful argument, and I think many people will share the view that you have. At the end, though, you were saying that we need to have conversations about what kind of society we want to live in, and not let the technology either enhance existing inequalities or not just let the technology determine the kind of society. But I was wondering, isn't this then really challenging when you have either companies or others making decisions in relation to the use of technology to achieve these goals of substantive equality, but those goals may not necessarily be shared more widely? So I'm just really trying to work out how you see this conversation that you're calling for. How is this conversation going to take place such that the goals are also shared goals?
Right. Yes. I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's something really to keep in mind, that there's always a perceived or a potential perceived tension between what, for example, the customer wants and what a company wants, or what the client wants and the company wants, or whatever it might be. I actually think that the Venn diagram is more a cycle that we actually believe, because I think if you think about substantive equality in the way that I think about it, it is actually not about burdening one side over the other. It is about making the lives of both sides better. Because at the moment, what we're seeing is that we're using certain types of decision criteria being used that are actually not good at measuring merit, right? So at the moment, we very often, you have to use a proxy for everything. Like you're hiring a person and you look at the reference letter, which is a proxy for whether they're going to be a good worker or not. But it's a proxy, so it has limitations. So we have to start questioning whether those data points that we're using, those proxies that we're using, are actually good enough to measure merit or competence, or if there are more like a legacy of a tool that always will advantage a certain group over another, even though they might not be deserving. So the idea is actually not to burden like a company or the public sector. It is about trying to figure out how can we actually measure merit. So it's not about forcing somebody through the door that doesn't deserve it. It's about realizing that many people walk through that door that don't deserve it. And that we actually try to help uncover hidden talent. Because at the moment, people that deserve to go to certain universities don't, and they would be fantastic people there. And then many, many people would do an amazing job at your company. People that wouldn't actually get sick should be granted insurance. So I think the alignment is actually much closer. I think it's really about just thinking about the decision criteria, if they measure competence and merit. And I think that's in the interest of the private and the public sector and the individual. I think the goal is actually the same.
Okay, so there's a question here, which I think is a nice follow-up to the question that I've just put to you. And this is a question from Feja, do forgive me if I've mispronounced your name. So would you please like to ask the question live, Feja? You can unmute yourself and put your video on and pose your question to Sandra.
Yeah, hello. So one of the things that strikes me around the conversation about recognizing bias is that a lot of the time the data sets that you're talking about come from multiple sources. So it's all very well sort of looking at a single thread, but when it's a combination of multiple sources, you're looking at trying to sort of develop policy. I mean, I'm more from a sort of climate change background, so you're looking at trying to develop fair and equitable solutions around a climate change policy. How do you determine levels of bias? I mean, it seems I can see the kind of singular application that you've mentioned around hiring people for particular jobs and gender discrimination, but for much bigger issues, I just wonder about the application. And again, I mean, I may be picking up on Professor Akande's point about it's all very well getting that kind of information and data open and in the arena of the sort of wider public, but getting the responses by those in power to get an honest conversation. And an honest conversation has to be in inverted commas, because that's a very manipulated phenomenon anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, two quite big things.
Yes, two quite big questions. And I'm not sure if I can give you a satisfactory answer, because they're definitely open questions. I don't think I can tackle or solve. However, I can agree with you. I can absolutely agree with you that this is, a very complicated problem when you're talking about the multiple sources of data and combining of data sets. One type of bias doesn't exemplify or realize itself in the same way everywhere. So like gender bias is different in India than it is in Austria, than it is in the US, right? There might be issues of gender bias in all those places, but how they manifest themselves is very, very different. So you have a global component there, so that bias is very differently expressed there. Then you have different notions of bias and fairness. Again, an Indian, a South African, an Australian, a German version idea of fairness might differ completely. And on top of that, all those notions change over time. Again, probably one of the reasons why I named the paper why fairness cannot be automated. Yeah, so be it. Yes, then technology is not good enough. It doesn't mean there's something wrong. I think it's good, right? We should have like the ability to change over time. We should have the ability to be diverse in what we believe in. So if anything, I would call on technologists to actually start to embracing the fuzziness and the gray areas and the changing notion of how people perceive fairness and justice. And yes, probably there won't be a one-fits-all solution. Thank God. That's an awful way to think about solutions anyway. Hardly everything has ever been achieved where you have a one silver bullet that fits everything. Yes. And in the same way that we have, companies operating different jurisdictions where there are different laws that they have to follow, they might also have to follow different notions of fairness if they go there. I think it's something like the diversity aspect is a feature, not a bug. So it's a technology that needs to adjust and not us. However, at the same time, I see hope that we might come to an agreement of what we think about fairness, at least on a high level notion, in the same way that human rights have developed first on a local basis and then have spread out globally. We might actually come to an idea or some notion of what fairness means in a global setting. This is like future music. I don't know when, if it will happen, but I'm optimistic because it has happened with human rights law as well. And to go back to your to your point about incentivizing, because I think that was the main issue. Yes. So on a basis, I also agree with you on this point. Somebody said it once in a forum that I was in that said, imagine you're sitting at a table with all the heads of the big companies and all the CEOs, basically in a table that's surrounded by billionaires, and you have to tell them that they got their business model wrong, right? Why should they change if they don't have to? So what I would counter, as I said, is first of all, apart from the reputational damage that comes from it, but even if you don't believe in that, there is legal rules that will kick in if they're being discriminatory, regardless if they know about it or not, right? Because intent is not necessary for non-discrimination law to kick in, thankfully, right? And the other thing is really that I want to start the conversation that it is costing you money to have a bad algorithm. It is less profitable to have a biased algorithm. If you had an algorithm that is unbiased, it would be in your business interest. Because again, I think very often we use criteria that are actually not good enough to measure competence and merits and the truth. But to do that, to figure out what those good criteria are, right, and how to think about the the social story between the data points, you actually need a very diverse team of people working together. It's like one of the reasons why I love working at my department here at the Oxford Internet Institute here at Oxford, because there are so many people that are nothing like me that can enlighten and find and show me my own blind spots, right? To figure out the social story behind the data points, you need ethicists, you need lawyers, you need social scientists, probably psychologists, and they need to work with tech people. Like tech alone will not solve it, but if you have the right people in the room, then you can actually make it work. And I think in a less burdensome way that you would actually think. So I think there is really room for both sides to win if they just change their perspective of what equality law actually wants you to do. At least that's my aspiration. I can be naive about this too, but that's the thing I'm marching for.
Thanks very much, Feja. Sandra, in your talk, you've kind of set out the sort of objective. Where should we be trying to get to? And you've talked about why we should be trying to get to the place that you are advocating. And just in the answer that you've just given now, you started to talk a little bit about the how. How do we get there? Your point about diversity. So Anna's got a question for you, which I think is still on this question of the how, but it's more on the tech side than on the broader side. Anna, would you like to unmute your microphone, turn your video on if you would like to put your question to Sandra?
Hi, thank you very much, Sandra. I really enjoyed the talk. So basically my question is, once having identified that there's a bias using your technique, so what are the technical solutions, if there are any, to try and fix this bias? Because so if there's one variable, one metrics that the company is using, then maybe that's relatively easy. I'm not a computer scientist or anything, but what I know is that sometimes they use like multiple variables metrics, and sometimes even the creators don't know exactly why the algorithm is behaving that way, the black boxes. So if I was just wondering, if you could tell us a little bit about the technical solutions that are out there about black boxes. What's your opinion on this from a legal perspective?
Yes,
thank you very much.
Fantastic question. I tried to give a couple of my thoughts on this. Yes, how to do it. So I think there are various ways of tackling it. One way would be, if you remember the example that I gave in the talk with the math grades, where girls are getting worse grades than boys, even though their math skills are just as good, if not better. So if you learned about this, let's say, because an interdisciplinary team was been working on it, and you had a social scientist or a gender studies scholar on it, and they alerted you to that, right? Then you could think about how can we fix this on a tech level. So you could do a simplistic tech solution, which would be to say, let's do grade inflation, for example, and say, a B for a girl counts as much as an A for a boy, right? So you count for the biases there. That would be one solution that you could do. And or you could say, well, maybe grades are not a good way of assessing math skills anyway. Maybe we should think of other or additional criteria, because you go to an exam, it's 1 hour, that's your stamp for eternity. Maybe that's not a good way of doing that. Maybe there are other criteria that would be a good proxy or even direct measure of competence, right? That could be a way of how you could try to fix it from a tech perspective. The societal perspective is actually tackling the brains of the teachers that gave the wrong grades in the first place, right? That's the other component of it. This is why I try to make the distinction between tech bias and societal bias, because actually what you really want to do is talk to the teacher and make them aware of their implicit gender biases. And at some point this will change, and then they will create data that is actually unbiased or actually assesses merit in a way. So both of those two things need to happen at the same time. As an interim solution, as you will, as like a plaster or like a band-aid for the illness that is disparity, you can do something with tech, but it's never going to heal the underlying wound that we have. That will only happen if we tackle the teacher's brain or anybody's prejudiced brain that then affects people's lives by making certain decisions. With the black box system, yes, you're absolutely right. We are not there yet to fully understand what's going on in the black box. So the best way also to think about this is the distinction between why and what. We know what's happening, but we don't know why it's happening, right? We are very good at figuring out what is happening. So with the bias tests, undeniably, it will tell you whether your algorithm is not inviting Black people to job interviews. It will tell you that. There is nothing there is no lie it could tell, which is good, much better than humans, by the way, because humans can lie, algorithms can't. So there is the what that is actually quite interesting. It will also tell you what happened. It will tell you who got the decision. Very often the why is not quite clear, right? And that is more a political, philosophical question of how much why do you need to know to trust the system? Like how many whys do you need to go back until you're happy to trust the system? And that's the philosophical question that we as scholars, policymakers at some point need to tackle. There are techniques that tell you a little bit of what's happening, but the full logic of the algorithm doesn't, right? But you're still going to be able to see what's happening. And in order to tackle the problem of bias on the tech level and the societal level, that's still good enough. Different question is if it's ethical to use a system that is not fully self-explanatory, if that makes sense. But yeah, even though the systems are imperfect, you can use them to do something good.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Anna. And we've unfortunately run out of time. It just leaves me, first of all, to say thank you to Sandra Wachter for fascinating presentation. Thank you to all of you who have attended. I've really enjoyed the discussion, and I'm sure that all of you have also enjoyed and taken a lot away from the discussion. Just before we close, let me remind everyone that there'll be another seminar in this series, which will take place in 3 weeks' time. It will be with Annabelle Gower, who is at the University of Surrey, and she will be speaking about the regulation of digital platforms. She'll be presenting an analysis of the economic and societal effects of digital platforms and discussing policy options based on a recent report that she submitted on this topic to the European Parliament. So I very much hope that you'll all be able to join us for that on the 10th of June. And there is now, I think, a link in the chat for you to be able to sign up and register for that webinar. So thanks to all of you, and good day to everyone. And Sandra, thank you once again.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Bye-bye all.